This is Dr. Tara Montgomery. I'm the director of the School of Agriculture, and I wanted to welcome everyone. And we're very happy to have Wisconsin Farm Bureau Federation and Dr. Chuck Nicholson and Dr. Leonard Polzin from UW-Madison here to talk about USDA's recommendation for milk pricing. So welcome, and hopefully you guys can learn a lot.
Thank you very much.
You guys go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I'll introduce myself first. I'm Chuck Nicholson. I work at UW-Madison. I'm a dairy economist, supported by the Dairy Innovation Hub, the state legislature's investment in the 3 UW campuses that work on dairy here at Platteville, River Falls, and in Madison. Leonard, I don't know if you want to come up and introduce yourself here, standing behind the computer screen.
Certainly. So Leonard Polzin, dairy economist. So formal title is Dairy Markets and Policy Outreach Specialist, funded through UW Extension.
Okay, great. So this is the second of 4 different presentations that we're making on different aspects of this thing we call the recommended decision that came down from USDA, which is basically the recommendations that they have for changing the system of milk pricing going forward. Today, we're going to focus mostly on one element that deals with Class 1 differentials. Those are related to the pricing of milk that goes into beverage use. I will give you a little bit of an overview about what we talked about at UW River Falls on Monday, which relates to the make allowances, which actually have perhaps a little bit more importance in this part of the world than this thing we'll talk about today. So the agenda that we have. Oh, actually, yes. First, Leonard, you want to talk about scanning this?
Yeah, so those of you that are online or in person, both, please, if you can take out your phones and scan the QR code here. We'll just gather some information about your kind of interests and preferences on things. And then when in one of the questions, it'll ask you to rank your preference or which you're most interested in. In order to do that, just make sure you click on it and then slide through and drop it in the order that you would like.
So we'll give folks a couple of minutes to do that, and then we'll jump into the other parts of the presentation that we're going to make. maybe give you another minute or so to finish that up if you're not yet done. And we'll go ahead and start with the presentation.
Select all of them, and then after that, you can drop them right or move them around. Yeah, so for those of you that might be having trouble with one of the questions that asks you to rank them, if you just kind of select all of them first, and then it'll put it into the top box, and then you can rearrange your ranking preference once they're selected.
Okay. So I think at least the folks here in the room have completed. Maybe that's some kind of sign that folks who are not in the room have also gotten that far along. So let's go ahead and kind of follow on with the presentation components here. So what I want to do first is talk a little bit about what our agenda is. And that is actually to give you a little bit of background on the federal milk marketing orders so that we have sort of a shared understanding of why we do this thing in the first place before we dive into some of the details about the proposed changes. We'll do a quick overview of the whole set of proposed changes that USDA announced on the 1st of July. We'll talk a little bit about why are we doing this? What's the motivation? What's the problem that these changes are intended to address? And then we'll get into sort of the meat of it, which is thinking about the implications of these changes to two key elements of milk pricing. One is the make allowances. Some of you may have heard about that already. And also Class 1 differentials, which is the focal point for our discussion this afternoon. Then we'll take a little bit of a break to allow folks to ask some questions. We have some group discussion questions. You can participate in the room here, or you can also participate online if you're interested in kind of joining that discussion. And then we'll wrap up today's session with some discussion of sort of the next steps in the process, including the important element of this producer vote, the producer referendum that will likely be coming up early next year. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Leonard to kind of do the first elements of the proposal or the presentation. If you choose that, actually.
Perfect.
Okay.
So the federal milk marketing orders are established by the Agricultural Marketing Agreement Act of 1937. So that's the existing legislation that made all of this possible, right? So everything that we're doing, all of these changes are taking place within the construct that original legislation allows us to operate in, right? So if changes are recommended or proposed that are outside of that, right, then USDA is not allowed to incorporate those or to consider those in their recommendations, right? So the objective of federal orders, which were started by the act in 1937, is to promote orderly marketing conditions in fluid milk markets. Also to improve the income situation of dairy farmers, to supervise the terms of trade in milk markets, to achieve more equality of bargaining power between producers and processors, and to ensure consumers of adequate supplies of quality milk at reasonable prices. So we're just going to take a look at some of the activities that federal orders do. We'll kind of look at some that people may be aware of or knowledgeable, kind of top of mind when you think of federal orders. Then we'll dive into some that maybe are no less important, but maybe are not as readily aware for folks. So the federal milk marketing orders, they provide the classified pricing and pooling. They collect dairy commodity prices. They determine handler prices based on end products. And that's where, for that one, that's kind of the big reason for make allowance and how those calculations come out. So we'll see that in a little bit here. Establish minimum uniform pool or establish minimum uniform prices across the pool. They perform weights and measures for component and volume audits. They ensure timely payments to producers. And as we said before, collect market information. So other things that they do is export certification services, dairy standards and product grading. They administer the fluid milk processor promotion and the dairy research and promotion programs, such as the checkoff programs, and the pandemic market volatility assistance program, the milk donation reimbursement program, and things of the like. So here's a map of our 11 federal milk marketing orders. And it is important to consider that not all milk is priced based on federal milk marketing orders. So not all milk is sold in marketing areas, and milk buyers other than Class 1 in a regulated area can choose not to be regulated. So the key elements of this decision that's been put forth so far are the following. So first is the change in standard milk composition. So previously we're at 3.1% for protein. That'll be increased to 3.3%. Other solids will be increased to 6%, up from 5.9. Non-fat solids will be 9.3%, up from 9%. A big reason for this is, as we said in the beginning, federal milk marketing orders are to promote orderly marketing, right? So what USDA saw was that what's happening in the industry as far as components being delivered from producers to processors may not be fully represented in what the calculations are compared to what they're seeing in the market. So by increasing these milk composition standards, hopefully it'll lead to increased orderly marketing and greater representation in the marketplace. So removal of cheese barrels from the Class 3 pricing, increased make allowance for cheese, butter, NDM, and dry whey. So these are used in Class 3 and Class 4 pricing, and it'll be 5 cent to 7 cent increase per pound, and increased butterfat retention factor in cheese. Also proposed is the reversion to the higher of advanced Class 3 or Class 4 skim milk price for that Class 1 skim price, and a new addition for a provision to adjust Class 1 price for the ESL milk. Increased Class 1 differentials. We'll dive into that in a bit more detail here today. So increase in Wisconsin of about $1.20 per hundredweight and retain the $1 per 60 hundredweight minimum differential value. So we'll kind of dive into some of the key issues here and get to the meat of the details.
Okay. So I mentioned earlier that one of the things you want to do is talk about why are we doing this? And this has been a very long process if you think about the discussions that have gone on for a number of years, but there's also been in the past year an extensive series of hearings at which USDA collected information from lots of different parties and organizations throughout the dairy industry. That resulted in hundreds of hours of testimony, thousands of pages of documents. And that's actually the basis, the evidence that was provided that underscores the information that Leonard just presented to you about the changes that are going to be made. But one of the things that was actually a key issue that prompted the hearings to take place in the first place was make allowances. They were seen as a key issue. The basic argument was that the make allowances that we use to figure out the value of components in farm milk were not appropriate any longer. They had not been adjusted since the year 2008. And some of the symptoms that we saw of that were depooling, milk not being priced under the Federal Milk Marketing Order pool when buyers were not required to do that. I would also argue a related question or related issue is we actually have seen less pooling in this part of the world over time, and I'll show you graphs of both of those things here in a moment. We saw declines in over-order premiums, prices paid above the minimum regulated prices. We saw cooperatives reblending, that is paying farmers in their cooperative less than the full amount of the minimum regulated price. And in certain situations, these negative producer price differentials were also reflecting a problem. So let's actually look a little bit at the kind of information that underlies these different symptoms. So if you're able to see this online, I've got a graph that has kind of a blue line and an orange line. And the blue line is actually data that's talking about the costs of processing in cheese as measured by the Bureau of Census for the United States as a whole. And you can see that in general, that blue line has gone up over time. And in particular, early in the 2020s, reached a pretty significant peak, right? So we have seen, based on that indicator, increases in manufacturing costs for cheese that are part of the evidence that we use to think about that make allowance for cheese. At the same time, and probably not coincidentally, we've seen reductions in the over-order premiums shown here by the orange line with a kind of a trend in there. We don't have more recent data available to us than the end of 2021. But there's been a definite decrease in the amount of over-order premiums that have been paid. And there's been a linkage made between these increasing costs of manufacturing and the amount of over-order premiums that are being paid. This is actually representing the situation here in the upper Midwest, but there are similar kinds of patterns if we go to other parts of the United States. The state of New York actually collects specific information on over-order premiums in a way that we don't do here in the upper Midwest. You can see a similar kind of pattern of decline in those premiums from about $1 per hundredweight to often less than 20 cents in recent years. So this is a more common problem than just here in this part of the world. It's something that we've seen generally throughout a lot of different milk producing areas in the United States. I mentioned earlier that depooling and less pooling were symptoms of a problem. This graph is actually showing the percentage of milk in Wisconsin and Minnesota, farm milk, that was pooled on order 30, the order that we work with here in this part of the world. You notice maybe two things about this. There's a lot of bouncing around in that blue line, which means we are pooling and depooling milk over time. And there's also a black line that's showing how the total proportion of farm milk has decreased from above 80%, if we go back to January 2015, to under 75% in recent months. So we see growth in milk production in the states of Minnesota and Wisconsin, and we see a smaller proportion of that milk being pooled under federal milk marketing orders. So again, lots of variation, pooling and depooling, instability in the marketplace, and a trend over time towards less pooling of milk. Okay. So for us to understand some of these changes, it's going to be helpful for us to have a little bit of a review, a brief one, on parts of the complexity of how we actually price farm milk in the case of milk that would be used for making cheese. So we have a pricing formula that many of you are probably aware of that is based on product prices and uses those to calculate milk component values. So if we're thinking about class 3 milk, milk used for cheese, we start with 3 product prices. These are wholesale market prices that are reported by USDA monthly. And we use those prices in formulas that help us to calculate component values that are going to be the components, or how components would be paid for farm milk. So, for example, the butterfat price is going to be used to calculate a value of butterfat in farm milk. That and the cheddar cheese price are going to be used to calculate a protein price in farm milk. And the dry whey price is going to be used to calculate an other solids price for farm milk. With those component values, basically we add up the component values times the amount of components that are actually in a producer's milk. And that will tell us the minimum price that farm milk will sell for as regulated under federal milk marketing orders. So the idea is we start with products in the marketplace and we get to a value of all components, and that value of all components is going to define what the value of farm milk will be for the purposes of setting prices under federal milk marketing orders. Okay. So for other classes, we have a similar situation that's shown here in this graph. There are 4 total product prices that are surveyed. In addition to the 3 I've already mentioned, we add non-fat dry milk. we calculate an additional component, non-fat solids, in addition to the protein, butterfat, other solids. And with those, depending on the use of the milk, we're going to assign values from class 1 fluid products, class 2 soft products like yogurt, ice cream, class 3 cheese and whey products, and class 4 kind of basically everything else, but mostly butter and milk powders. So we take the values of all the classes, we think about the utilization, the amount of milk in a particular area that is used in those different classes. That's going to define the value of an order pool. It's a pool of dollars, the total dollar value for milk based on all the uses in a particular order. And then that is the thing that directly gets turned into this thing we often refer to as the blend price. That would be the minimum price that would need to be paid to farmers within a federal milk marketing order area. Okay. So that's a little bit of background on how we do that. But one of the things that we also need to understand a little bit is this make allowance idea. So I'm showing here a specific formula. We're taking the butter price at wholesale price in the market and turning it into a component value for the butterfat price for the purposes of pricing farm milk. And so you can see here, we've got a butter price. We're subtracting some number. That number we're subtracting is the thing that we're talking about as the make allowance. And it's what does it cost to transform milk into 1 pound of butter? And then we also have a yield factor, which is talking about how many pounds of butter we can make from 1 pound of butter fat. And the reason that number is more than 1 is because in addition to the butter fat in butter, we also have water and salt and a few other milk solids. So with 1 pound of butter fat, we can make 1.2 pounds of butter that could be sold in a wholesale marketplace, right? So that make allowance is maybe where I want to draw your attention right now, because that's one of the key things that USDA is proposing to change. And the basic bottom line is if we're subtracting that make allowance from a wholesale market price, an increase in the make allowance will result in a reduced or smaller value of the component, in this case, butterfat. And that's, as economists say, that's sort of like other things being equal, kind of in the short term. If we started out with a $3 butter price and we subtract a bigger number, that's going to give us a smaller component value for butterfat that would be used in pricing farm milk, right? So with that in mind, let me show you a graph here that's going to talk about 2 different ways to view the changes in class 3, cheese and whey, class 4, butter and non-fat dry milk values. I'm going to use September 2024 as an example of the product prices that we're looking at. I want to talk about sort of 2 different ways of looking at this. One is just looking at the value of components, like what I talked about as being derived directly from those formulas. So when we do that, we get a bar that looks something like this. And what it suggests to us is in a month like September 2024, the value of class 3 components with the changes that are being proposed would be about 92 cents less than under our current pricing formulas. Similarly, we can look over to class 4, not that important in this part of the world, but important for other folks. That's a little bit lower reduction of about 70 cents in the values of components in class 4 based on those changes to the make allowances. And remember I said if we increase the make allowance, we should see a reduction in the value of the components, and that's being added up here across all the different components in class 3 and class 4 milk. Leonard, when he introduced the overall changes, noted that an additional change was actually to change the reported composition, the prices at a reported composition, increasing the protein and other solids content of the milk. When we take that into account, we actually get sort of a very different picture, which is for class 3, we're looking at about 30 cents on that reported price that actually includes accounting for more components in farm milk. And for class 4, it's about 40 cents reduction. So when you account for the compositional changes, increasing the component values in the milk, you end up with a smaller decrease in the overall price that we're looking at here. Those are 2 different ways to view it. for the important part of the producer pay price here, though, is really the light blue bars are the things that are more the impact that would be likely to be seen in a farm milk check, because the orange bars are really the reported prices that USDA is going to report, but may not reflect the actual milk composition on the farms, right? So what we're looking at here, for example, the value of components in a month like September 2024 would have been about 90 cents lower with the changes to the make allowance formulas that we're talking about. Okay. And I note in here, just to add again, the change in standard milk composition is the thing that accounts for the differences between the depth of the blue bar and the depth of the orange bar there. Okay. So overall, in an order like order 30 here in the upper Midwest, where we price milk on the basis of the components in the milk, we would expect that the component value and producer paychecks would be lower. And that is if the milk is currently being pooled. And we're not quite as clear about what would happen to the value of milk that is not currently being pooled. And I'll show you a graph about that in a moment. On the other hand, for reasons we'll talk about in a minute, we would expect that there should be higher producer price differentials, more of that pool value above the minimum component values there, and that more milk will be pooled under the proposed changes. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the impact on pooled versus unpooled milk. And I've got a graph here that's going to use several months in 2024, going from January to August 24. And if we look at the current value of class 3 components, that's all the components that were using class 3 at their value, times the standard test of milk that was received here in order 30, and we add the actual PPDs during this month, the producer price differentials, we get a series that looks like this. Okay, and we started a bit above 18. We got to a little bit under 24 if we look at that class 3 component value plus the producer price differentials. And then we can look at what happens with this is the current system that we have. Those are the actual prices that we would look at for those. We can look at the impacts if we account for the changes in the make allowances. And I'm now showing you a dashed line that shows that in each case, those are about 90 cents lower in terms of the component values at class 3 plus the PPD during the months that we're looking at here. And that's consistent with what I showed you in the kind of the bar graphs earlier. But we can also get an imputed and implied an estimated value for the milk that was not being pooled. If we look at the all milk price for the state of Wisconsin, we look at the value of the components in milk that was pooled, and about 75% of the milk in Wisconsin was pooled. We know 25% of the milk would not be pooled, and we can use that information to help us calculate a value for non-pooled milk, which is being shown here by the orange bar. Okay. So the importance of this is if your milk is currently being pooled, you're likely to see that 90-cent reduction. Okay. That would be the component values as long as your milk continues to be pooled. And I suggested we're likely to see actually more milk being pooled. If your milk is not currently being pooled, we actually don't really have a good idea about what the likely impacts would be. We can't calculate a formula. We'd actually need to know what the current values are that producers are being paid for that milk. This is an estimate across all farms in the state of Wisconsin. But the likely impact is you're not going to see that 90-cent reduction based on the component values, because that only applies to milk that was currently being pooled, right? So it's possible actually that we can see some price increases on that milk that's not currently being pooled as a result of the kinds of changes that we're looking at here. So it's kind of important to keep in mind that what we're looking at is the values, how they change for milk that would continue to be pooled. We're not exactly sure about the impacts on milk that is not currently being pooled. Okay. So overall, the perspective on make allowances looks a little bit like this. I think the industry had a consensus, and that was shown up at the hearings that USDA held back last fall and into earlier this year. There's a consensus that we needed to do something about make allowances. Adjustments were needed. The discussion really now ongoing, and was certainly a discussion during the hearings, was how much adjustment do we really need to address the problems that I said were the symptoms of this make allowance issue. Basically, we've done some looking backward. I'm going to show you in a minute how looking forward might be a helpful thing to do in addition, because the changes in the formulas are going to affect milk supply and demand going forward. Talked about a 90-cent reduction in the component value. I'm not a dairy farmer, but I've been around the industry enough to know that 90 cents a dollar a hundredweight starts to seem like real money in terms of decision making. And so there could be some adjustments that would be made to how aggressively cows are culled, how aggressively they're fed. And there's also going to be some impacts on the demand side for milk as that milk price becomes a little bit lower for milk buyers. So the impacts will pay out over time. So we can't just look at 1 year or a few months. We need to think about maybe 4 or 5 years into the future. We need to think about whether those overorder premiums are likely to return. Those are one of the symptoms of a system that probably needed some adjustment. And we are likely to see less impacts on milk that's not currently being pooled or is being reblended by cooperatives that could be, in fact, actually beneficial in this case. Okay. So that is sort of the summary of the key points that we talked about on make allowances from our discussions at UW River Falls on Monday. What I want to do now is spend a little bit of time talking about another key element of this decision, which is this thing we call Class 1 differentials, and they're being increased. And just to sort of set the stage, the Class 1 differentials are things that add value to the overall milk pool in an order. And as Leonard had mentioned earlier on, Class 1 milk that's used for beverage use, is the focal point for this whole system of regulation that we have. So it's kind of important enough for us to take a look at the proposed changes there. All right. So what are Class 1 differentials? Well, they're one part of the Class 1 price calculation. So I'm going to show some formulas here. If you, the details don't seem that important to you, I'm perfectly fine with that, but I'm just sort of trying to lay the groundwork for where this fits into the overall picture. So we currently have a system that takes the average of a Class 3 and a Class 4 skim milk price, adjusted a bit, and adds a certain amount of money to it, 74 cents per hundredweight, to come up with this thing we call a base Class 1 skim milk price, right? We have a way to calculate the value of the butterfat in milk to go along with that skim side of the farm milk equation. And then we're actually able to calculate a base Class 1 price that includes the value of the skim components and the value of the butterfat that was used in a beverage product. Okay, so that's our base Class 1 price. Well, we actually start with that base Class 1 price, and then at each location in the US that's actually processing beverage milk, we will add a location-specific differential to that amount. That's how we actually arrive at the Class 1 the Class 1 price at a particular location. Okay, so we start with this base price, and then we have something that is very specific to a location, typically where a plant is located. And I'll show you in a minute, actually, how that gets played out across the United States. Okay, so why do we do this? Well, the differentials are designed to provide, as you see in the slide there, a financial incentive for farmers and cooperatives to supply the Class 1 market, the beverage milk market. So the beverage milk market tends to be closer to population centers rather than where manufacturing milk tends to go, which is closer to where farms are. So the system is designed to provide an incentive to move milk to those fluid milk processing locations by giving it a higher price when it gets to those locations, a higher price that would be paid to farmers, right? So this rather colorful map is showing you the current values of these Class 1 differentials at all 3,108 counties and other geographic sublocations in the United States, right? Current range of values goes from about $1.60 a hundredweight to about $6 a hundredweight. And if you can follow the color coding, those $6 higher values are actually down in the southeastern part of the United States. Here in Wisconsin, we have an average value that's about $1.70 per hundredweight, okay? So the red areas and the orange areas tend to be Class 1 differentials at a county level that are a little bit lower. And the darker colors, the blues and the greens, are values of Class 1 differentials that are higher. And again, the idea is we're trying to give an incentive for that farm milk to move to fluid milk processing by attracting a higher price, contributing to a higher overall value of the pool across the different classes of milk. Okay. Well, so why do we do this? Well, it actually has a lot to do with the availability of milk and the populations that want to drink milk in different parts of the United States. This map is actually showing by counties whether we have a milk surplus or not relative to the demand for milk at that location. So you can see here in Wisconsin, lots of parts of Minnesota, we have green counties, which means we produce more milk than the total milk needs in those counties. And we see actually in other parts, especially the urban corridor, the Northeast, parts of Southern California, down into Florida, parts of Texas, we have red, which means that we have milk deficits. We have less milk being produced in those counties than is needed to actually supply the overall demand for dairy products in those locations, right? So the basic pattern is here, we are much more deficit in general as we get into the southeastern parts of the United States. And that's the reason that we have this gradient that goes from relatively low Class 1 differentials up here in a place like Wisconsin to higher differentials down in a place like Florida, where we have a much lower milk supply relative to the demands, particularly for beverage milk, okay? So we need to give additional incentives to get that milk into locations in the southeastern United States. It costs money to move milk around in a tanker, and so we need to provide that additional incentive, and that's what the system is designed to do. Okay, so USDA basically, as a part of its decision, said the value of milk varies by location. So we are going to calculate a new value at every location in the United States. And that's designed to represent the evolution that we've seen in the spatial organization, where farms are, where populations are over time, and the increased costs of servicing the Class 1 market, which is kind of code for it costs money to move milk through transportation. Okay, so they said that as their justification. What determines what that value should be, since USDA said it varies by location? Well, I'm an economist, so I think about certain kinds of things, but I think about supply and demand. So the farm milk supply, not just the milk in terms of the volume, but the components at particular locations is important. The dairy product demand at different locations is important, and that relies a lot on population, although we have some differences in per capita per person consumption in different parts of the United States. Also, the transportation costs, what it costs to move milk from a farm, assemble it to a plant, from one plant to send a load of cream to another, or for distribution of fluid milk products in a packaged form. All those are parts of transportation costs that affect the value of milk at a location. Another thing is, where do we have plants? Because we don't have fluid milk plants, we don't have cheese plants in every county in the United States. So those plant locations become important. They're the places where we actually can process the products we're talking about here. Another thing that's related to that is how big are the plants, what capacity they have to accept milk. They don't have an infinite capacity in different locations. So milk might have to go a little bit further to the next plant down the road if that one plant is already full, okay? So changes to any of those will change what those spatial milk values will be in a particular county or a particular region of the United States, okay? So if you think about this, we haven't changed these Class 1 differentials since the year 2008. So think about the different kinds of changes that have taken place in the dairy industry in now going on 15 years plus. There have been a lot of changes in the places where we have farms and milk production, been a lot of places in the population and where the demand is being located for dairy. We've seen certainly some changes in transportation costs as labor rates and diesel prices go up and down. And we've also seen some new plants come online, sometimes bigger plants, and we've seen some plants close down. So all of the things that affect those values have changed in the time period since the last time we took a look at this particular value, okay? So there's a lot of complexity there. A lot of stuff has changed. How did USDA reach a decision about what to do? Well, what they did was they adapted some results from some economic modeling work that was done as a collaboration between Cornell University and then later on UW-Madison, where I work. And this is an approach that allows them to consider all these different changes simultaneously. So this particular approach is trying to say, how could we organize the supply chain for dairy in the United States to minimize the total cost? And that provides us with some kind of competitive benchmark that says, this is the most efficient way, the lowest cost way that we can organize to move milk from farms to plants, to move intermediate products from one plant to another, and to transport products to final demand locations where consumers want to have them. So they looked at some economic modeling results that indicated milk values at different plant locations that were processing beverage milk, Class 1 plants, based on information from May 2021. And they had this detailed assessment that allowed them to take into account all the different things that had changed since the last time that we had adjusted these Class 1 differentials. So just to show you a little bit diagrammatically what they were looking at, this is trying to represent the movement of milk and dairy products through the system here in the United States that was captured by this tool that USDA used. And then we can actually look at some of the results that come from that in terms of what is the best organization, the way farm milk should be moved, the way products should be moved, if we're talking about beverage milk in the United States. So this is the kind of evidence that was used to help determine what these Class 1 differentials should be. And the results of this economic exercise, economic analysis, suggested that there were parts of the United States where we probably didn't need to make really significant differences or significant changes to those Class 1 differentials. Those are mostly kind of shown here in maybe the confusing color scheme of a bit of blue and a bit of pink, right? Places where you see some green or where you see some orange, or especially like dark brown, are places where bigger changes were suggested in this Class 1 differential for counties based on the economic analysis that was done. Here in the state of Wisconsin, we were suggesting from this analysis about $1.70 per hundredweight increase in Class 1 was an appropriate value. You can see there's some other places up there that are more than $3 increase, and those are mostly in the area from North Carolina over to Mississippi, right? So this is what the evidence base said. What did USDA do? They did something that looked a heck of a lot like what that economic modeling analysis suggested. This is actually a graph showing their proposed changes to these Class 1 differentials. If you look across the United States as a whole, the average value of proposed changes was about $1.24 per hundredweight on Class 1 milk. But there was a big range from under 10 cents, nickel, kind of around the Denver area in Colorado, to more than $2.30 in that area. That's kind of the blue band again, going from North Carolina down into Mississippi. So they proposed changes county by county to that value of Class 1 milk. And the pattern actually reflected a lot the economic analysis that was done about how milk values have changed over time. Okay, so with that as background, what are the impacts of actually doing this, proposing these changes? Well, as I mentioned earlier, Class 1 is the part of the pool that has the highest value. If we increase the amount of payment to farmers for that part of the pool, we should see an increased value of the overall order pool. We'll see an increase in the reported prices. USDA milk marketing orders call them the statistical uniform price, sometimes called the blend price. We should see increases also in the producer price differentials because that's reflecting that value above Class 3 components. And we should see an increase in the all milk price as a result of this. Now, of course, in a place like Wisconsin, where we have about 5% of our milk that falls into that category Class 1, that's going to be a lot different kind of impact, increased value of the pool than it would be in a place like Florida, where more than 80% of the milk is actually going into a beverage use. So larger impact in orders that have a larger Class 1 utilization, you're applying that higher price to a bigger proportion of the milk, okay? If you look at what USDA proposed is that $1.24 per hundredweight increase overall on average, the total value across the United States would be a bit over $500 million. Okay? So let me also kind of remind us, we talked about the changes to the make allowances being reducing, if you will, the component values in milk and the potential pay prices. This part of the change is kind of having the opposite effect, where it's actually trying to raise the overall value of the pool, in this case, by about the $500 million that we're talking about here. So we can also look at, for a couple of different orders, what the impact would likely be on the PPD, that amount above the base component values. In order 30, we'd add about $1 million per month to that class one, by that class one differential increase. That's about 3 to 5 cents per hundredweight over the total pool, or about 10% higher than the average PPD in recent years of about 30 cents per hundredweight. In order one, which is the Northeast, a lot of New York and Pennsylvania farms there, that actually would add about $2 million per month to that pool. And that's a smaller pool than here in Upper Midwest. So we're talking about a 20-cent increase per hundredweight over the total pool, or about 7% higher as an average PPD if we think about like a year like 2024, okay? So the class one differentials are important because they add value to the pool, which ultimately gets reflected in these higher values of the PPDs. And this tries to give you a little bit of an estimate of what those increases might look like. Okay. So I mentioned increased value of the order pool, but think about it from the perspective of a buyer of milk that's going to put milk into a carton and sell at a retail store. Their costs have gone up. The minimum price that they have to pay for that class one milk is going to go up. So there's a little bit of disagreement among industry analysts and economists on exactly how much, but what we might expect is actually some impact on retail fluid milk prices as a result of this. That will have some impact on the demand for milk that will go into class one or class one utilization, and the overall demand for the product at the grocery store. So it's a little bit hard to foresee the future, but some of the economic modeling work that we've contributed to suggests about a 1% decrease in class one utilization. So it's going to be taken a little bit off the top of that increased pool, and perhaps about an 11-cent per gallon increase in the fluid price per gallon as a result of the changes to the class one differentials for the United States as a whole. Okay. So let's kind of come back to the fact that I focused on the class one differentials. That would definitely be one of the things that's going to affect the value of that pool, the class one milk price. Other things also will have an impact. Proposed changes in make allowances that we talked about affect the class 3 and class 4 prices. Those prices also affect that base price for class 1. So there's a potential for an impact of those things on this class 1 situation as well. In addition, the return of the higher of those two things, which Leonard mentioned as one of the other components of the changes, will make a difference to this. And the changes to the component composition of milk will also affect what those class 1 values will look like going forward, right? So there are a lot of moving pieces here. I've tried to highlight the class 1 differential so we understand that, because it's really one of the more important parts, and it's one of the parts that actually puts money back into the pool as a result of these potential changes. So I want to share a couple of tables, and there are lots of numbers here. Maybe just focus on the color patterns a little bit more than anything, but USDA was required to do an assessment of the impacts of different changes that were being recommended. And they did that in this case by the different federal orders in the United States, the 11 of them that Leonard showed you a map of earlier. And they found actually that for most of those areas, there would be an increase in the overall value of the pool. But for 3 areas of the United States, there would be a decrease in the value of the pool if we look back over the last 5 years that ended in December 2023. And those 3 areas would be the Upper Midwest, unfortunately for us, California, and Arizona. Overall, the combination of the make allowances and the changes to class 1 differentials and the changes to milk composition, USDA would estimate would have put $2.4 billion more into the pool values than under the current pricing formulas. But notice there's some very distinct differences based on where you are in the United States. And we can also put that on a per hundredweight basis. When we think about the blend price, and we see a similar kind of pattern there. USDA said the blend prices would have been about 10 cents lower here in the upper Midwest, about 20 cents lower in California, and about 3 cents lower in Arizona, but overall would have increased. Okay, so the key point is here, there are some changes that are likely to take place going forward, and they'll have very different impacts in different parts of the United States. All right. So I mentioned earlier that it can be helpful to look back, but we got to be a little bit careful because the dairy industry is a dynamic place. Dairy farmers, dairy processors, consumers are making decisions all the time and changing those decisions over time. So when we look back, we don't account for any of the changes that might have taken place in milk supply or milk demand. And that can be a little bit dangerous because the dollar hundredweight off the milk price probably, again, as I mentioned, has some impacts on how farms are going to make decisions going forward here. So let's think a little bit about what happens over time. And this is a little bit of a simplified thing, but it maybe illustrates the kinds of things that we might expect and how there can be some offsetting types of effects as we implement this and think about going forward over the next 4 or 5 years, okay? So a lot of folks that I've talked to have focused a little bit on this particular connection where the increased make allowance means we have a lower farm milk price, at least for that milk that is currently being pooled. But if we have a lower farm milk price, that probably leads to 2 other adjustments on the part of folks who make decisions based on that price. Likely to see some adjustments to milk production at the farm level. Also likely to see some adjustments in terms of the amount of milk demanded for a product like cheese, okay? So on the milk production side, probably see less production. On the milk demand side, see more demand. Again, I'm an economist, so I think about the supply and demand components. And basically, we've affected the supply and demand balance for milk going forward here. So what happens? So we bring down the production, we bring up the demand. Well, we're likely to see some additional pressure for price premiums, and that can have some kind of offsetting effect on the farm pay price. And in addition, that increased make allowance is probably going to draw more milk into the pool, along with the higher PPDs that we're seeing there, and more milk being pooled, and the higher PPDs can also have an offsetting positive effect on the farm pay price. So the key thing to think about is we may make a decision about this and implement it early next year. We'll talk more about that process here in a moment. But this is going to play out actually over the next 4 to 5 years. It's not something we should just look at 1 month and say we're done, okay? So there'll be this dynamic adjustment. So with that in mind, I want to share some of our economic modeling work on the likely impact on Class 1 prices. If we started in 2024 and went out to 2028, the overall average that we would expect on that Class 1 price would be about 55 cents per hundredweight, but you can see it varies actually quite a lot from about 55 cents in 2024 up to 75 cents in 2027, but it's actually lower in 2025 and 26. The reason for that actually has to do with the adjustment prices that we would see in the Class 3 and Class 4 markets that are the base for that Class 1 price, right? So USDA says they're raising Class 1 differentials by $1.24. On the other hand, the values of Class 3 and Class 4 milk that are the basis will go down by some amount that we've already talked about. That's an offsetting effect. The net effect on that Class 1 value looks a little bit more like 55 cents a hundredweight rather than $1.24 per hundredweight. Okay. So we can also look at over time the values of components in Class 3 and Class 4. I showed you 1 month earlier. If you think about the Class 3 price over time, we see a certain kind of pattern with an overall projected reduction during the next 5 years, about 20 cents. We actually see a different pattern for Class 4, and you may say those orange bars look higher with the recommended decision, which means they result in a higher price because of the decision. And I would say yes, and the reason we see that in the later years is that milk supply response. We tend to see that show up first in tightening of the markets of milk for butter and for non-fat dry milk use. When we look at components, the gray bars here are showing us kind of the overall value of components. Different story here, bigger impacts on the component values in a year like 2024, becoming more smaller amounts in later years, again, as that milk supply and demand adjustment takes place. And we can do a similar thing kind of for the Class 4 components, okay? So this is a decision whose dynamics are going to play out over time, over the next 4 to 5 years with some different impacts in different times and some different impacts based on the metrics that you're looking at, the data that you're looking at to think what those impacts would be. Okay. So I'm going to wrap this part up with a little bit of summary perspective on differentials. Like for make allowances, there was kind of a consensus that differentials needed to be adjusted. Where the differences were how much, just like for the case of the make allowances. I've looked at the comments that USDA has been provided as a result of this recommended decision. And there are a number of them that express concerns about particular values of the class 1 differentials in a particular county. We don't need to go into the details of which those counties are, but the folks there have some pretty strong concerns about those. And the key question is that I've tried to sort of give you a sense for is how much producer value can we put back into the pool from the higher class 1 differentials that tends to offset a bit that taking out of the pool is due to those higher make allowance values. Okay, so I'm going to turn it back over to Leonard to talk about the next steps in the process. Now that we've kind of covered the core part of what are the impacts of a particular part of the decision.
Perfect. So the we're going to lay out like every step in the whole entire hearing process here, right? And everything that led up to the hearing. So all of the grayed out ones are ones that we've already done, we've already experienced, right? So most recently of which a lot of our data and information analysis is based on is this USDA recommended decision, which came out in July, right? So, and as Chuck just mentioned, there was, people had filed comments, right? That's what just happened where on September 13th here, from that USDA takes and looks at what that recommended decision was, if there's adjustments, tweaks, additional considerations, things like this, right? I think it's important to note or to keep in mind that I think they definitely take those comments, they definitely take them to heart. But to expect exceedingly large new revisions, completely something, you know, out of left field from what we've seen in the recommended decision, I don't think that's going to happen, right? I think we're kind of headed down the track with some potential adjustments as we proceed. So what we're looking at next, and this is what's coming out, is that USDA will issue their final decision in mid-November. So this will be what they issue in November will be what is going to be voted on in the producer referendum. So that's really kind of the thing, right? That when producers decide and look at voting, that's what they'll be voting on. So once that referendum is held, we'll be looking, referendum will be held somewhere between around early 2025. It'll take 20 to 45 days-ish for that referendum process to happen, that voting process to happen. And then the implementation of those amendments from this final decision, we'll be looking somewhere around early 2025. So when we take a look at what the producer referendum is, it's dairy farmers will have the opportunity to vote on whether to, so there's an important distinction, whether to primarily, or first here, adopt the order with the changes in the final decision or terminate federal orders. So I'm going to repeat that just one more time. Dairy farmers will have the opportunity to vote on whether to adapt the order with the changes of the final decision or terminate the orders. So maintaining the current provisions of the order is not an option. And when producers are voting, they're voting on the order in which they are a part of. They're not voting on this entire system, right? So if you're a part of Order 30, and that's the order that you're voting on. So the big question here then is if we're voting for the proposed changes or to terminate the order, the big question is, are we better off with the order or without it? So again, we're not voting on whether we want to keep the proposed changes or not, or maintain the status quo. That's not the option. So voting out the order would eliminate the beneficial aspects of the order that are not directly related to milk pricing, including auditing, testing, market information, assurance of timely payments, all of these things. So unless these functions are replaced with a different legislation, which is not what we're considering, right? That would have to be completely separate, different process from this. All of these things would be terminated with the terminating vote. So if an order was voted out, likely result in farm milk prices approximating that class 3 price. This is the experience that we've seen in the Western order, which was terminated in 2004. And also our opportunities to pool milk in other orders would be limited as well. It would eliminate the payment of PPDs, which have averaged 29 cents from January 2022 to date. So right now we want to take just a little bit of time. We'll have some discussion questions. We'll see if there's some questions in the chat to see, there's things that come to mind of, such as how would these proposed changes affect your farm business, your farmer business? Would you be better off with or without Order 30 under the proposed new provisions? Additional information that will be helpful.
Yes, I guess we'll do a quick check of the chat box. We got some folks here in the room. If they have thoughts on these questions or other Q&A type things that we can address, we'd be happy to do that.
What cost of this to pay PPD? If there's a lot of PPD. I've seen it this year multiple times, haven't paid any for the support money. Ultimately, because now that like September, not like right here, I'd like to come and explain to you to the negative 29 cents. Okay, the school is at 20%. And these will be. Now, how is it right that, and again, we must not be living. Then in the process of having on the night of the following month to decide if they want to do a school, at what percentage they can take farm by farm, until they got a computer software program, how can you get our hands on that market? Now, to say a farm like myself, is a high component farm, we're going to be up. It's based on our components for September. On the first protein and other solids, we should have received 27 blocks. We ended up getting 26.65.
Is that your September milk check? September? Okay, first month we had negative PPDs in about 3 years. Bad timing for that. The basic answer to the question about you're selling your milk to a cheese manufacturer, I take it. They have the right under our current system because it focuses on milk for beverage use to make those decisions about being pooled or not being pooled based on their own financial interests. And that is the fundamental nature of the system that we have. Other orders have a little bit different sets of pooling provisions that make that a little bit harder for folks to do. They can't get in and out of the pool as readily. But the fundamental nature of the system is that we require people who make beverage products to be regulated if they're selling milk in these areas. And we do not require people who are making other products to do the same thing.
It's been 100 years old. I think that needs to be addressed.
Thanks.
And there again, we have to blame the federal government for, in my opinion, the lost school consumption. The milk that's available for these kids in school is absolutely horrific. We have lost one, but not two generations of milk makers, and the number is so low.
Okay, so you're absolutely right. We got a system that has been in place with a fair amount of tweaking for about 100 years. It came into existence for some reasons that have a lot of historical merit. We still have that system in its basic form today. And that basic form says basically we're going to charge more for milk that goes into a beverage product. That doesn't help with the demand side for sure. There are other factors that are related to the regulations about milk that goes into schools that we don't need to go into now, but those have also had some kind of impact on both the sales to schools as well as that next generation of milk drinkers. But we are dealing with a situation where USDA says, here's what the rules are. We're trying to figure out what parts of the rules we can reasonably change based on evidence that's been given to us across a broad spectrum of the dairy industry organizations and individual farmers. So there's a question at the Monday session that I actually thought was a really pretty good one, which is, it wasn't quite like, does USDA know what they're doing? But it was a little bit like, do they understand the implications of the decisions that they're making here? And my response was, I said, I think they do, but they are limited in actually what they can and can't change as a result of the process that we're going through now. And Leonard, I think, said it nicely earlier on, where he said, we have this legislation that the government put in place, and it's kind of like the rules of football. The rules of football, with the exception of that weird thing they did with the kickoff this year, have been pretty kind of standard for a while, like how many points you get for a touchdown, an extra point, and all that kind of stuff. Only certain of the rules can be changed. We can't change from the rules of football to the rules of baseball based on what USDA is able to do at this point. So they can make minor tweaks. They can take evidence on particular things. When it adds all up, they say it's a beneficial thing to dairy farmers in the United States. Turns out it's not such a beneficial thing, these proposed changes to certain regions of the United States that would include here in Wisconsin and other places like California. Anything to that?
On the food consumption side, like Chuck said, I don't think we have to get into details, but there has been some proposed legislation in the works to address some of those concerns too, and it seems like there's been some strong industry support there.
Full fat
So-
milk back in schools.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
So they can't hear. Oh, okay, sorry, yeah. Yeah, okay. Well, so kind of parse back through. So the basic question related to, why is it that one basic question was, why is it that a cheese buyer can be in and out of the pool? And we sort of talked about that's the way the regulation of the system works. We had some other conversations related to the impacts of federal government policy on fluid milk sales and future generations of kids growing up, maybe not being as excited about milk. We talked just a minute ago about the proposed changes that have been ongoing with that. So we'll try to do a better job of kind of getting. And the most recent comment was really about how a shortage of replacement heifers would be something that would be driving the milk price up going forward here. Something that I've also heard from other folks. No, I'm just saying that.
No, these heifers are probably worth what they should have think they were. This $800 to $1,000 for a training heifer, that was wrong. I encourage you to try to go on and get to that milk for that kind of money. See how long you last. Okay?
Well, the fortunate thing for me, we're talking here about the value of replacement heifers and whether it's an incentive or a disincentive to actually kind of keep things going in the milk supply pipeline. And the idea that the previous values were not really fully reflective of the value of that animal in the marketplace. My response to that is, I'm sure glad that it is not my job to be making up replacement heifers for running a dairy operation. I know that I wouldn't be very good at it, but actually that isn't my job. My job is actually trying to understand what goes on in dairy markets and policy stuff. We have a question over here. Yes. Okay, so the question is related to what we call pooling provisions about if you're not a fluid milk buyer, you're not buying milk for class 1 or for fluid milk use, you have the option to be pooled or not. There are some certain pooling provisions that say how you can get in and out of that pool. Generally, those are things that don't have to be addressed at a national level. They were not addressed at all as a part of the USDA's hearings. They could be addressed by a more localized process for an individual order. Okay? So if, for example, we had some orders be voted out, which actually I don't personally anticipate, that might actually encourage some changes in the pooling provisions in other orders. So those are things that would be adjusted there. They're not part of the discussion for this particular decision. Anything coming in online other than I can't hear?
No. Question. Where is the farm in this? Is there any plan on that to some of the things not addressed, or possibly going to be addressed? Discuss that.
Yeah, so at some point, and I imagine that some point will be in the year 2025. Fingers crossed on that, since already a couple of years past when we would typically do this. Congress will get around to doing something with the Farm Bill. And it's certainly possible that Congress would decide that some of the provisions that were part of a final decision that we expect to come out here in a couple of weeks are not to their liking. So they might actually say, I don't like that class 1 differential in that part of West Virginia where one of my constituents was complaining about something. So I'm going to mandate that USDA do something a little bit different. And they've actually undertaken that kind of intervention the last time we did a major overhaul of the whole system, which was in the year 2000. They actually said, no, you're actually going to price stuff in this way. They also intervened in May, well, in the 2018 Farm Bill, and in May 2019, that's when we went from the higher of class 3 and class 4 to the average of plus the 74 cents. So there's a possibility that they could actually make an intervention if the politics support something different than what comes down on this decision. And notice it's kind of very different processes. They're thinking about the political dimensions of this and how it fits to the rest of the Farm Bill. USDA is saying, we got evidence that suggested we should make certain changes, and we did our best to go through that evidence and make what we think are reasonable choices, right? So those are different processes. They can reach some different kinds of conclusions. One place where I think there may be a little bit more traction for those kinds of changes is the make allowances we mentioned had not been changed since 2008. And they heard testimony about a system in California when California had its own state pricing of milk, not part of the federal system, where they every year did a mandatory survey of all the manufacturing plants, so they knew pretty well what those actual costs of processing were for the different products. So it was a recommended or proposed idea to implement a survey that would update much more frequently the values for those make allowances, the processing costs and facilities. USDA, I think, determined they did not have the authority under the hearing that they put forward. It's kind of the boundaries, the guardrails, if you will, on what they could address during the hearing. They did not have the authority to make that kind of change. But I think there's an acknowledgement that Congress could say, oh yeah, sure, you're going to do that. And that might be one of the places where Congress could intervene. And actually, I think it'd probably be a helpful thing to have more frequent information in a mandated survey of the different costs of manufacturing. I don't know if you want to add something to that.
I think one other key place where a legislative addition or action to this that's come up in discussion that might be valuable is if producers of the industry have specific information that they want to see or access, or have that information displayed in a certain way or format that currently isn't, right? That if legislatively that could be dictated, right? If there's information that we want gathered, even on production or anything like this, right? That legislatively that would be able to be changed or included as well.
So should we maybe move on to some of the next steps in the process here, talking about the voting and other things, and we'll kind of wrap it up.
Any other questions before we proceed to that?
One quick follow-up. Obviously, people could say, well, it's something the state can do. Is there really things the state of Wisconsin could do?
So when you say, so the question is about whether or not there are things that a particular state could do here, specifically thinking about Wisconsin. So let me ask you a little bit, there's lots of stuff the state could do, but what are you kind of more specifically thinking about what the state could do?
The state could do some legislative fixes. It could address some things with the provisions to help with prices to help with people that have. You mentioned California, kind of was out to get kind of their own on a couple of things. Is there really anything that we have to do to the state?
So the question is really, is there anything broadly speaking related to, I would say, milk pricing or farm financial support that the state could do? And the answer to that is yes, there are certainly things that they could do. So some states, Pennsylvania, for example, actually has a whole system of pricing regulation that applies to retail prices for milk. And actually those are minimum prices that grocery stores must charge. The logic being that if you have to pay that much at retail, then that is going to be beneficial at some point to the farmer, in addition to the class 1 milk pricing that we have. That would be one example. Maine actually has its own milk pricing system that works a little bit differently than that. Parts of Virginia have their own parts of milk pricing. Generally, those are areas that don't have a lot of milk production and are not integrated into a national marketplace for cheese or an international marketplace as we would be here. So other states, I was actually at the University of Vermont back when the Northeast Interstate Dairy Compact, the 6 New England states came into place, and basically they said, nah, that class 1 price isn't high enough. We're actually going to mandate that it has this minimum value. Okay? So that ultimately had some kind of legal related issues to it. But there are things that could be done. States could say, we're going to pay 5 cents more on every hundredweight of milk in Wisconsin, as long as the taxpayers think that that's a good budgetary idea. So there's lots of things that could be done. Where it gets a little bit more challenging is to say we're going to have like our own state milk pricing. That'd be hard for us. First, we'd have to get rid of the order, and then we'd have to have this whole other state thing that worked for California because there are a bunch of Rocky Mountains between them and any other people. So yeah, there can be lots of creative things. One of the things that Leonard kind of mentioned is if, just for example, and again, I don't think this will likely happen, Order 30 was terminated based on the vote that Leonard will talk about in a moment. The state of Wisconsin could step in and say, we're going to provide some of that market information. We might pass legislation that would mimic the payment guarantees, those kinds of things, right? So that's partly about budgets, partly about political will, partly about need, but yeah, there's a number of things that states could actually do. Probably the experience is, unless you're in some small milk producing state that's kind of isolated, your ability to impact stuff is going to be hard because of that integrated marketplace we have, particularly for cheese.
So correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's my understanding that different states have different rules and regulations in auditing and compliance and things like this for handlers within the state as well, right? So some of that is financial reporting, auditing, things like this. So if there's state level rules or regulations in that regard, right? There's the ability to change or adjust those.
Okay. Let's go ahead and we'll carry on with the next part here.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the referendum process. That's basically the voting process, right? Like, so again, November is when the final decision will come out. And when that comes out, that will specify kind of the terms of engagement as we move forward, right? So when the USDA announces the final decision, it will specify the details of the voting process, including the representative month that counts for eligibility, right? So that will take into account the milk that was pooled into certain order in that month, which will determine then who's voting in that order and in that process. And it will also determine the timing of the vote. So date requirements for ballots to be postmarked and received by USDA. The typical time frame is 30 to 45 days. So when we take a look at eligibility on who is voting in this process, let's take a look at producers. So a producer has to deliver milk to a handler that is regulated by the Federal Milk Marketing Orders geographic area in that representative month. And again, that representative month will be specified when that final rule is stated. The producer must be actively engaged in producing grade A milk at the time of the referendum. And for cooperatives, for them to be eligible, they have to represent producers who are actively producing and marketing grade A milk within the order in the stated month, and actively marketing milk, which means processing or selling in that order. And they have to be recognized by the USDA. So I'm sure we've probably heard this topic before, but block voting by cooperatives. So because co-ops are considered producers under Federal Milk Marketing Orders, they are allowed to block vote on behalf of their members. So the co-op must provide USDA with certification of the resolution authorizing the vote at the time that the ballots are submitted. If the cooperative does not block vote, its members may cast individual ballots. So in order to have the referendum process, let's talk a little bit about the voting threshold. So to amend the order with the provisions of the final decision, 2/3 of the voting producers must approve. So if that threshold is met, then it's like a yes vote, right? And the order with or as proposed goes through. If that 2/3 of the voting producers, if that criteria is not met, then 2/3 of the milk volume represented by voting producers must approve. Under block voting, cooperatives may cast a unanimous ballot for all their members who are eligible, which contributes towards that 2/3 of voting producers or milk volume. So, and that last point again, USDA will first count producers, then milk volume if needed. So one important distinction here is that it is of those that are voting, right? It's not 2/3 of total producers, it's 2/3 of the producers that are represented in the vote. So again, just to kind of review some of the key elements of USDA's recommended decision, it's the change in the standard milk composition, protein to 3.3%, up from 3.1. Other solids increased to 6%. Non-fat solids to 9.3%. Removal of barrel cheese from the class 3 pricing, increase the make allowance, reverting to the higher of versus the average of for that advanced class 3 or skim or class 4 skim milk price for the class 1 skim price. The inclusion of the class 1 price for ESL milk and increasing the class 1 differentials. So we'll kind of have Chuck do a kind of wrap up here of what the recommended decisions are and what their impact is.
Okay, I'm actually going to slide back here. Thanks, Leonard, to the previous slide. Part of what I'm trying to remind folks of is there are a bunch of different things that USDA has proposed to change that are shown here. We focused on Monday a bit on the make allowances, talked a little bit about them here this afternoon, focus more on the class 1 differentials this afternoon. When we go to the Farm Wisconsin Discovery Center in Manitowoc on Friday, we're going to emphasize the other elements of this decision. But it's kind of important to keep in mind that all these things interact and will affect producer pay prices going forward here. So what I kind of wanted to do to wrap this up with our basic discussion is key thing that we're interested in is really understanding something about the potential impacts on farm milk prices of making these changes, in part because what Leonard just said was farms are the ones and their co-ops, farmers and co-ops are the ones that are deciding on whether they accept these changes or would prefer to have no regulation at all. So part of what I just said was that the impacts are going to depend on all the changes in the recommended decision, not just the make allowances, not just the class 1 differentials, but all of them. We're tending to consider them a little bit separately to break them down into what we hope is a little bit more bite-sized pieces, recognizing that sometimes the bites are pretty big and complicated. These impacts are going to vary by order. I showed you information earlier that suggests regions of the US with a lot of manufacturing milk, especially for cheese, are going to see generally negative price impacts. Other parts of the United States are likely to see more positive impacts. There's also some differences that maybe we don't need to emphasize a lot here between places like Order 30, where we base on the prices of components, and Florida, where they base on the price of, or they base their prices on butterfat use and skim milk, which is a little bit different than paying on the basis of components. And finally, I want to reiterate, when we make a vote for something like this, the impacts of this are not going to be kind of what happened in the past 5 years or in the first month, as sometimes we talk about. There are going to be things that will play out over time based on changes to milk supply, milk demand, and the other things that actually affect things like changes in manufacturing costs as well. So there'll be an impact that takes place over time, and we should kind of have that longer time frame in mind as we think about what the decision might be for an individual farm or co-op. Okay. So what I want to do is kind of close out with some additional reminders of where we think farm milk prices in different classes and overall be going over the next 5 years based on this. And this is a graph that repeats a little bit things that I showed you earlier related to class 1, the blue bars. It also shows class 2 milk, again, not really important here in the state of Wisconsin. I mean, not trying to say anything bad about ice cream manufacturers or anything. As a proportion of the volume, it's pretty small here in Wisconsin. That's the orange bar, and then the all milk price bar is shown there in the gray. So this is looking across the US as a whole. And so you can see we would see some pretty large changes in the class 1 milk value. That's adding to that pool value, adding to that PPD. The offsetting effects are going to take place more in class 3 and class 4 component values and prices. And so we get to a milk price, an all milk price for the US as a whole, overall, that actually is less than a dime away from the average we might have predicted for the next 5 years if we hadn't made any changes at all. Okay. So the pattern over time is going to be different, lower in a year like 2025, higher in a year like 2027. The average that plays out over time for all milk priced in the United States doesn't look that much different than it would have looked without making these changes. Okay. So, and these are, again, take them for what they're worth, forecasts, projections, modeling analyses. I'm not saying they're right, but what I'm trying to do is give us a sense that there's an indication of how the patterns might play out over time. Okay? And then we can also look at the other side of this equation, which is how those class 3, class 4 component values and prices are likely to play out over time. I shared some of this information with you previously. The biggest negative impacts on those class 3 component values we'd actually expect to have happen in the next couple of years, 2-3 years. After that, the impacts moderate a little bit based on the supply and demand balance for milk going forward. Okay. So that's wrapping up kind of the parts where we're showing you some data. What I also want to do is say that we have developed some resources that are available for free online at our Dairy Markets and Policy website, that is dairymarkets.org. And these are information letters on different topics related to the ones we talked about today. Those are shown in red, make allowances and class 1 differentials. We also have an overview of federal marketing order functions that Leonard gave a bit of a talk about. And we talk about some of the other proposed changes to federal marketing orders. And one that we'll actually talk about next Monday in Madison is really what are the implications for Order 30 being with us or not being with us as we go forward. Okay. So with that, I'll pull this stuff up there. There's contact information. Happy to have you reach out to either of us or both of us if you have additional questions that we can answer kind of by email. So, make them up to you. You want to do evaluation stuff? Or?
Yep, if
Okay.
we could take out our phones just one more time, 3 quick questions that we will ask of you here. And then Chuck and I will be around and we'll check online as well for additional questions that folks might have. Yep, so there was a question, if you can scan again, yes, that would be great. It is a different link. Well, it looks like folks are wrapping that up there. Any questions coming in online?
Okay, I'm here now.
So the question, in case you didn't hear it, is, basically a broader way to say it is, are all these changes implemented at the same time? We focus on the make allowance change and the Classman differentials here, and the answer is yes. All those things will be implemented at the same time.
Yeah, and details on implementation, is my understanding, will come out in that final decision as well.
Yeah, so that will talk about the time frame of the vote, the month for eligibility. So that's coming up in less than 3 weeks, so presumably less than 3 weeks. Yeah. So the question is, I said 10 cents per hundredweight on all milk across the United States over the next 5 years would be kind of a projected model impact for the implementation of all these changes over time. And so the question is, how big a variation might we expect around that on the basis of the analysis? And so this particular approach doesn't lend itself really well to understanding in a quantitative way exactly what that thing you called the standard deviation, the variation around that to be. It actually takes about 10 minutes to actually run one of these things. So to do that a bunch of times requires a lot of time. But what I would say is we know that there can be some pretty significant variation around that. So I would say, we're probably talking at least 10 cents possible difference up or down on what that might look like. So it might go -20 or it might go to 0, it might be 15 cents. We're probably not talking $1. So I would say, as we project this stuff forward, this also assumes like we don't have another pandemic, we don't have a trade war with China, we don't have all kinds of other stuff, which we kind of have to do to think about what happens over the next 5 years. This is just trying to give us a way to come to grips with the idea of, will the magnitudes of these changes over the next 5 years be super big or maybe not so big? So I'm not saying it's 10 cents, but I'm saying it's probably in that 10 cents, 20 cents range, not in the range of $2 or $3. Okay, great question. Thanks.
And so we need to do a very complicated job of trying to put it in. And then ultimately, premiums will come down. What are the premiums are you talking about? The obvious thing is, over the last 5, 6, 7 years, the process is going to take away from you. Okay, and they're using premiums today to provide them with the future. They've added on trucks.
Yep.
How is that going to come back?
Okay. So the question is, when we mentioned basically there would be some pressure for increases in premiums. What premiums are we talking about there, and how is that going to work? So what's going to be driving that? Okay. So one of the things we got to be a little bit careful about is if we look at 20 producer milk checks, we'll have premium things that are all over the board. Even if we try and like put them into categories that are sort of similar, we're going to see some very different stuff. And part of that is the fact that people who are cutting those milk checks have lots of different ways of defining what they consider to be a premium. Co-ops also have the ability to take in the pool of dollars and distribute it as they see fit among the members. And so they do some different things where they distribute those monies differently, even the farms that might be in a similar location, similar size, similar components, all those kinds of things. So there's a tremendous amount of variation that takes place there. What I'm talking about here is a couple of effects. We mentioned actually early on, a symptom of the fact that we got an issue that was trying to be addressed by the hearing is exactly what you talked about, this tremendous decline in premiums to basically like zero when they used to be 50 cents a dollar in other parts of the world. So that same pattern of a decrease pretty significantly in the state of New York as well, right?
Where did those dollars go?
Well, so the argument is those dollars went into the fact that the manufacturing costs were higher.
Now they're still doing more. That's what make allowances are allowing, correct?
Well, so yeah, but see, the idea is here. Well, hold on, please, hold on.
Now, allowances are going to allow them to pay more, correct?
So the make allowance change is going to bring into better alignment, according to USDA, what it costs to transform milk into those products to have an adjustment factor based on the wholesale market prices that we start with, right? So producer or processors will have the ability to pay less for the milk components. What I'm saying is there's going to be some supply and demand adjustment over time that is likely going to put pressure on milk prices and presumably also on the premiums that get paid. And those premiums can be expressed in a lot of different ways. Even if we're really talking about a market premium, they could be expressed as a quality premium. They could be expressed as a difference in the hauling charge is being made. That's the way I understand milk checks to work, is there's a great deal of ability to kind of play around with the different elements. So what I'm suggesting is, with this change, smaller incentives to make milk, bigger incentives to buy milk, we're going to see some offsetting effects, some pressure that will likely bring back premiums. The estimates that we've done, we're not talking about major increases, but we might go 5 to 10 cents total value of a premium across those different categories as a result of the kinds of changes here that affect that supply-demand milk balance. Any other things we should address online? Okay. Well, maybe what we can do is say we're actually getting kind of close to the time we'd intended to stop anyway. We can sign off from here. Folks have additional opportunities to kind of interact with us at a couple more meetings. Their email information, I'll flash that back up there again. Happy to have you get in contact with us by email. For those of you that have our phone numbers, you can call us on the phone, talk to us about stuff. Perfect. So there we go. Okay, so thanks a lot for your attention here. If you're online with us now, great to have you. If you're watching this after the fact, you'll have to kind of catch us in a different way through those other mechanisms. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.